A challenge and a call to arms tonight about the American soul, about freedom and about our public square, who we are as a country and where we are headed. These are the kinds of ideas that Arthur Brooks focuses on as head of the prestigious Washington think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, known usually as AEI. He's traveling across America's campuses. He was just at that one across, in Durham. All together now, Duke. Thank you. I told him that too. But at any rate, he's traveling across America's campuses to really talk to a new generation about the American experience and your role as students in it. Arthur's a professor, so he's right at home in this setting. He knows how to be provocative and prodding. Before joining AEI, Brooks was a professor at Syracuse's Maxwell School of Public Administration. He has an undergraduate degree in economics, as well as a master's in economics and a PhD in public administration from the Rand Graduate School. But before he launched his career as a writer, professor, and all-around provocateur, Arthur was a musician and a well-respected musician on the French horn. I want you to meet the whole man. So you know that this is not going to be your ordinary public policy talks. Dr. Brooks will begin with a challenge, and then he's going to join our students and one of our top professors, Professor Daniel Kreiss, in a conversation. I'll introduce them in the moment, and we'll also try to take some questions from you, but I want you first to just give a really good, warm welcome to Dr. Arthur Brooks.
Oh, man. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for having me here at the University of North Carolina, at this prestigious school. Thank you so much to the Park family for your incredible generosity in supporting this wonderful endeavor, and to see all the Park fellows here. It's really inspirational, and it's humbling for me to be in front of you here today to talk about what concerns us all about our country. It is true that I've been traveling across campuses in the United States, also traveling a good deal talking about what's right and what's wrong with American politics and policy around the world. I just got back the day before yesterday from a trip to Asia. 5 days ago, I was having the very conversation we'll have here tonight in Dharamsala, India, with the Dalai Lama about what is wrong with American compassion as we see in American politics. One of the most fascinating discussions I've ever had, as a matter of fact. But it should be of some interest, I think, to all of us that what is concerning us about our politics and policy in America reaches all the way to the Himalayan foothills and is of great interest to His Holiness the Dalai Lama even. So what are we talking about in America today? Well, I write as a scholar, I write as an economist about the free enterprise system. What's right, what's wrong, what should we be concerned about, what should we celebrate? And this is a big area of discussion, particularly since the 2012 election. I've never seen a more divided time in Washington, D.C., running a think tank. I mean, I think that's no secret. Looking at the 2012 election, it was a time of real celebration for political liberals, a time of real reflection and depression for political conservatives. I've seen, among my conservative friends, people that I'm closest to, I've never seen a level of despair that I've seen since November of 2012. Maybe for some of you who might enjoy that fact, but in truth, it is a hard time for political conservatives. I'm actually married to one, and she's actually the most optimistic person I know. I'm married to an immigrant. She came to this country because of the limitless opportunities of the free enterprise system. And I mean, here's actually an example of how optimistic my wife is, and so I can relate this to the conversations of the day. 3 months ago, we were driving home from a parent-teacher conference that had gone really badly. Some of you who have kids, you've had these experiences too. We have a grades problem at that point with one of our sons, and we were in the car, and it's kind of this icy silence, and finally my wife says, "I think we should look at it this way. At least we know he's not cheating." So. But after the 2012 election on that Wednesday morning, my wife said, I just don't know if our country's going to be okay. That's how a lot of people on the free enterprise part of the political spectrum feel right now. And so here's the question. What's wrong with American conservatives? What's wrong with that part of the political spectrum? If you're a political conservative, you want to know, and if you're not a political conservative, you're probably pretty interested in this as well. After all, most of us here are very interested in the American political system. We want a better country for everybody. So let's sort this out a little bit tonight. I'm going to submit a few comments, and I submit them for your consideration. I would like to say that what's wrong with American conservatives today is what's wrong with me. And here's what I mean by that. 3 years ago, I was at a Thanksgiving dinner with my extended family. Now, I'm from a family of political liberals in Seattle, Washington, a family of artists and academics in Seattle. And so running the American Enterprise Institute, which is the famous 75-year-old institution dedicated to the free enterprise system, family dinners for me are super fun, as you can imagine. And we were going around the table talking about what's going wrong in the American economy, and you know, one after the other, my relatives were saying, you know, what's wrong is that the rich don't pay their fair share in this country. We need more regulation. There's too much greed. If finally the rich would get their foot off the neck of the poor, everything would be okay. And then it came to me, and they asked me what I thought. They know what I think, but they're just being nice. And it's sort of my family ritual that I have to stick up for capitalism once a year on Thanksgiving, and whether we need it or not. And I said, look, you guys, it's not that there's too much free enterprise in this country. There's not enough free enterprise. Crony capitalism and the overwhelming state, they're dragging everything down. We need lower regulations and lower taxes and set entrepreneurs free. And, you know, I did my whole thing, and I thought, you know, I'd win a few votes. Nothing, nothing. And somebody in my family that I'm close to, she said, you know what, I think that you just want to give tax breaks to the people who give donations to your think tank. And you know what else? I just read an article in the Seattle Times about a little girl who lives with her mother in a car. What's your precious free enterprise system going to do for her? And I lost the debate. I lost it right then and there. I completely lost the argument. You know, as a matter of fact, I looked like kind of a jerk. I said, he used to be such a nice little kid, and then he grew up and became an economist, and what happened? So later, I'm complaining about it with my wife. Now, I'm figuring my wife, I just told you about her, she's going to be super sympathetic to me. I mean, I figure she's going to be annoyed. I say, you know, I don't know what's going on with these people. These people are my family. Why they don't understand. I figured she's going to be on my side. And I say, you know, all they have are platitudes and anecdotes. I have real data about what's wrong in this country. And my wife said, actually, you don't understand. You deserve to lose that argument. And I said, what do you mean? She said, think about it. You're talking about tax rates and regulation. She's talking about a little girl who lives with her mother in a car. What do you care about more, money or people? And I said, well, people. And she said, so why don't you start talking about people and how they're affected by free enterprise? And if you can make that case, maybe you'll win. But if you can't make that case, you don't deserve to win. And she was right. She was absolutely right. The problem with conservatives today is that they're losing the moral argument. Conservatives are talking about materialistic things. They're talking about money. They're talking about things that matter less than what Americans truly care about. And until and unless they can make the moral argument for the system, they're going to lose. So let's think about what that moral argument might be by looking honestly at what's going on in America today. Economists like me will tell you that America is in a weak recovery from the recession. That's a lie. The truth is we're in two recoveries. We're in one strong recovery and one non-recovery. The top half of the income distribution is in a very strong recovery. I saw last week that Lamborghini sales are at an all-time high. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. But it seems like it's kind of evocative of what's going on. House prices are going up in the top half. Unemployment's down to 3.8% for people who have college degrees. You find that wage inflation is becoming a problem for people in the top half of the income distribution. Now, let's look at the bottom half. We're still in recession. 15% unemployment. The average family in America has seen real purchasing power decline every year for 5 years. Every year, you make less than the year before for 5 years. That's the first time that's happened since the Great Depression. Now, that basically tells us that half of the population is still in decline. And the half that on the top that's making all the decisions, the ones who are forming the opinions, us, we're actually looking at an economy that's doing pretty well. And you blend them together and it looks like a weak recovery. But we have to pay attention to the fact that people in the bottom are having a different experience than the people in the top. So, if you're in the bottom half, which is how I started out, when I was a kid, we were at the 25th income percentile, just at the edge, lower middle class, just at the edge, okay? So if I were now where I was growing up, we would be seeing a terrible economy. I'd probably be afraid of losing my job, or I'd be unemployed. I'd be thinking about a way to get disability to support my family. And I'd be looking at politicians going, how come nobody's working for me? And what are they hearing from our politicians? Here's where it gets interesting. You basically have two messages out there. You have the message from the President of the United States in the last election, and it basically comes down to, the rich have your stuff, and I'm going to get it back. Okay, now that's not to put too fine a point on it. I know there's better rhetoric than that, but I'm trying to cut to the chase. Now, most Americans, when I look at the data, don't find that very compelling. Most Americans are not really envious. I saw a survey that looked 5 years ago at American and French attitudes toward some of the world's most famous figures. Okay? They were asking in particular about Bill Gates. This is when Bill Gates was still the wealthiest person in the world. And the question was, what's your feeling? Do you have good feelings or bad feelings about Bill Gates, and why? And the American reaction was basically, from all across the income distribution, poor, middle class, and rich, was, I sure hope my kid is the next Bill Gates. Right? They asked the French, and the French reaction was basically, let's take his stuff and burn his house down. It was a completely different kind of reaction. America's different. We're not very envious, and the idea that somebody else has your stuff isn't really compelling to most Americans. But then let's think, what's the alternative? What are they hearing from the Republican Party? What are people in the bottom hearing from conservatives? And the answer is, the bottom half are takers. They're moochers. They're the 47%. That's what they're hearing. Now, which one are you going to choose of these in the bottom half? Are you going to choose that you're a moocher, or that somebody else has got your stuff? Maybe you don't like either one particularly, but I can tell you right now which one people are going to choose. And I don't have to be some sort of PhD to figure that one out. They look around and they hear what they think is the message coming from political conservatives in Washington. They say, you know what? They don't care about people like me. They don't care about people like me. That is actually the response that explains the election in November. There's one statistic you need to know. YouGov.com, the Washington Post, Fox News, every reputable poll that asked the question, do you believe that Republicans or Democrats care more about people like you? Everyone found that at least 2/3 said Democrats are the ones who care about people like me, and only 1/3 at most said that about the Republicans. 38% of Americans leading up to the election said that Mitt Romney cares about the poor, only 38%. You can't win an election when that's what people think. When you don't think that people in power care about people like you. So what do conservatives need to do? Now, if you're a conservative, you want to know what you need to do. If you're a liberal, you want to know what the playbook for conservatives is. So everybody should be kind of interested in this. What do conservatives need to do? You can't just say, care more. You have to figure what they ought to be talking about. You have to figure what they should be thinking, how they should be helping people more. And research, new research, holds the answer. So I have a friend, his name is Jonathan Haidt. If some of you have heard of him, it's because he wrote a big bestseller last year called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree on Politics and Religion. It's a great book. I highly recommend it to your interest. And John Haidt in that book talks about the morality of Americans. Okay? Now, he's the world's leading expert on the science of morality. He teaches at NYU, in the business school at NYU. And his work on morality is really groundbreaking. He went into this, the debate about morality, asking if we all kind of have the same morals, or whether or not we figure them out individually. Now that's no small question, right? It's one of the things that freaks parents out before they send their kids off to college is sort of the relativistic moral culture on college campuses. I mean, it's what parents, those of you who are students, your parents are at home right now worrying about that. okay? Oh, they're going to lose their morals, right? Because everybody's relative about everything on college campus. I have this friend who teaches at a Canadian university, and he actually did a poll of his students to say, if a child and a kitten fall into a well, which one should we pull out first, right? And it was 50-50 among his students, right? And he says, see, there's no moral compass on college campuses. Okay, that's a research question. Do we all have the same kind of morality, or is it really individualized? So my friend John Haidt, he asked the questions about morality to 132,000 Americans over the past 10 years. That's what he's been doing for the past 10 years. You can get tenure for anything. He's asking 132,000 Americans about what they think is moral and what they think is immoral. And here's what he found. He found that we all basically have the same morality. There are basically 5 moral pillars in American society today. 2 of the moral pillars are shared by basically 100% of the population, right? All of us in here share 2 moral values, have 2 moral values in common. Number 1 is that it's important to be fair. I have heard so many people in Washington, D.C. say, don't talk about fairness because it's too subjective. It's a huge mistake because we all demand a fair society, a fair system, and a culture that values fairness. We think it's fundamentally moral. And when people are unfair or corrupt, it drives us crazy. It makes us angry. That's a normal and a good thing. The second and more important pillar of morality, shared by 100% of the people, is that it's right and just to help the vulnerable. People who are weaker than we are. We shouldn't hurt them. We should lift them up. If there's a hungry child, we should help that child with the government if necessary. Almost everybody agrees with that. Helping the vulnerable is good and hurting the vulnerable is bad. Fundamental of morality. These are the 2 pillars of morality shared by 100% of the population. But John Haidt went on to find that there were 3 other pillars of morality that are only shared by about 30% of the population. They're only shared specifically by political conservatives. So what he finds is that political liberals and political conservatives are different when it comes to their morality, but they share 2 pillars in common. That's where it stops for most political liberals, and political conservatives have a little bit more complication in 3 more values. That's about 30% of the population. So what are they? Number 1, conservatives believe that respect for authority is moral and good. Okay, now, a lot of liberals respect authority, don't get me wrong, but it's not the same kind of visceral moral value. I wanted to test this, and so one of the things I get to do in my job is I get to talk to a lot of members of Congress, which is really interesting. People who are in the public eye a lot, people who are doing public policy up close and personal. And one of the things I like to do is kind of a Rorschach test. I'll say, when I say some word, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? Okay, so I was talking to a congressman from Florida, very conservative congressman from Florida, and I said this. I said, you know, one of the things the research finds is that respect for authority is a really conservative moral value. And he said, oh, I don't think so. And what do you mean? I said, okay, tell me the first thing that pops into your mind when I say flag burning. And he says, treason. Okay, so I call my brother, huge liberal. And I said, tell me the first thing that pops into your mind when I say flag burning. And he says, inadvisable. Number 2, second moral value of conservatives, not shared by liberals uniformly, is loyalty. Loyalty to group. Now, conservatives often think that liberals are unpatriotic. It's not true. But the reason that they think that is they notice that liberals don't have the same kind of visceral, almost physical attachment to the idea of nation that conservatives do. This is very common belief. And that's because of this notion that loyalty to group is a matter of basic morality. The third is personal purity, especially in matters involving sex. Conservatives believe this is basic morality. Liberals typically don't. Okay, now, John Haidt and I have shared this experience of seeing an example of this. There's a bumper sticker that's really common these days in San Francisco. Maybe some of you have seen it. It says, your body may be a temple, but mine is an amusement park. That's all you need to know. Okay, Those are 30% moral values: respect for authority, loyalty to group, and personal purity. There are a whole other set of issues that are 0% moral issues. So we talk about them as if they were moral, but they have 0% moral content. And those are questions of money. That's what I was doing wrong on Thanksgiving Day. I was substituting moral arguments for material arguments and losing because I was doing it. 0% moral support for money values. You talk about GDP growth, you talk about tax rates, people get really angry, but it's not for moral reasons. So you got three types of issues: 100% moral issues, 30% moral issues, and 0% moral issues. What does this mean for free enterprise advocates in America today? If you want to appeal to people across the population, if you want to win the future, you got to focus on the universal moral values: fairness and defending the vulnerable. If you focus on uniquely conservative social principles, you're going to lose because you're only going to appeal to 30% of the population. And if you make materialistic arguments, you're going to have no moral appeal at all. That's what's going wrong. Conservatives and free enterprise advocates are simply not talking and thinking enough about how to lift up the vulnerable, how to have a fairer society. And I'm going to talk about how to fix that very briefly. And then I'm going to leave it to you to think about that a little bit more. Conservatives, quite frankly, are losing the battle of moral arithmetic. They're handing over 100% moral issues to the other side and contenting themselves with 30% minoritarian issues of authority and sexual purity and loyalty and patriotism, and even worse, we're talking about money all the time, and that's just not going to work. Here's the irony of this when it comes to lifting up the vulnerable. The free enterprise cause here and around the world has pulled billions of people out of poverty, has done more for the truly vulnerable and poor than any other system in the history of the world. If you compare 1970 to today, and you look at the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less, this is a standard definition of poverty from development economists. The percentage of the world's population living in the world's worst poverty since 1970 has declined by 80%. I bet you didn't know that. Most people don't know that. A decline of 80% in the percentage of the world's population living in the world's worst poverty? What happened? What's the explanation? You got to have an explanation. This is the best anti-poverty achievement in the history of the world, and it goes relatively unremarked. Shocking. So what's the answer? Is it the United Nations? Is it US foreign aid or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank? Is it central planning? No, 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 no. It's 5 things: globalization, free trade, rule of law, property rights, and entrepreneurship. It's the American free enterprise system that has been spread around the world starting in 1970 that has literally pulled billions of people out of poverty for the first time in the history of the world. That's a profoundly moral thing that must not go unremarked, in my view. If you believe that somebody should have the opportunity to go to school in sub-Saharan Africa who never would have otherwise, you have to agree that we need a system that will do it for those people beyond charity, to people we've never seen, we've never met, we've never heard from, and whose parts of the world we don't even know exist today. Only with a system can we do this. That's why the stakes are high. It's not about winning elections. It's truly about helping people. So what do we do? What's the strategy? What am I telling members of Congress? What am I telling politicians? What am I telling myself? What do we do? 3 things. For the first time, a tangible, poor-centric policy agenda that uses free enterprise for the benefit primarily of the poor. Second is facing up to our blind spots, our weaknesses, things that we've gotten wrong. And third is a long-term commitment to the agenda. I'm going to go through this quickly so that we can get to the second part of our program. The first is a pro-poor policy agenda. It's time to stop fighting against the government and against things. It's time to start fighting for people, for vulnerable people. Let me give you an example. It's hard to find people in Washington, D.C. who are not really exercised and worried about the entitlement crisis. It's bankrupting the country. Everybody from Barack Obama to John Boehner to Newt Gingrich to Dick Cheney, Every single person in public life in Washington knows that America is going to become insolvent ultimately because of the nature of our entitlement system. You don't have to be a Democrat or Republican to know that. Both sides know. So what does it matter that we change entitlements and spend less right now? The answer is this. If we don't reform entitlements, we will hurt the poor. We won't hurt the rich, we'll hurt the poor. How do I know that? 22 years ago, I got married in Spain, Barcelona. Great city. Loved living in Barcelona. One of the great things about Barcelona when I got married, no homelessness. It's crazy. I'd moved from New York City. Barcelona's great. It's a big city. There's no homelessness. It's wonderful. I go back today. There's a homeless guy living on the stoop of my house. Homelessness is up by a factor of 3. Why? Because of the Spanish debt crisis. Because of the austerity that came with the insolvency of the system. It hits the poor always and everywhere. There has literally never been a case of macroeconomic austerity in the world that has not been born primarily about the poor. If we think we're going to do it differently in this country, we're crazy. We're fooling ourselves, and we're going to hurt the poor. That's the reason that solving the entitlement problem matters. If you love the poor, if you believe you are morally commanded to treat the least of these, our brothers and sisters, with special care and respect, we must do something about the way we spend our government money, which is disproportionately going in welfare benefits to the middle class and rich. And that's not right. We have to solve that problem. That's an example of a pro-poor policy agenda that's radically pro-free enterprise as well. The second is facing up to our traditional blind spots. Let me give you an example of one. It's very easy in conservative circles to talk about how lousy the government is, but let's think about the adjuncts of government in the corporate sphere. The corporate cronies who are sidling up to the trough and getting special benefits. GM, Solyndra, the big banks. The corporate cronies who get the benefits and special deals that all the rest of us don't get. That's a blind spot for the right because it's pro-business. That's got to stop because it's not fair, and ultimately it will marginalize the poor and make us insolvent. The right and the left have to come together to condemn that. Third, we have to make a long-term commitment to the vulnerable. It's easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to start talking about poor people now. Let's see if that works between now and the next midterm election. No. Politicians need to be willing to stand up in front of people who are struggling and say, I'm going to fight for you and your family, whether you vote for me or not, and actually mean it. It's not, it will win, ultimately, but more importantly, it's the right thing to do. Here's my last word. It's a hard time in Washington. I know a lot of you are distressed by the contentiousness and the bitterness and the gridlock, but it's actually a great time. We're working through values like I've never seen before. We're working through philosophical issues like I've never experienced. Conservatives have an opportunity to redefine their values, to focus on compassion for poor people and true fairness for everybody. That means that we can have a real competition between right and left in a way that no matter what will benefit the least among us. And that's a truly great thing. Contending for Americans' votes on the basis of lifting up the poor is the best thing that we could possibly do. It'll make us a better country because of the healthy competition that surrounds what we all care about, which is a stronger, healthier, fairer, better America for all of us. So for all that you're doing, for your interest in this, to the Park family, for your incredible generosity in making this possible, for making a better America and your interest in public policy, say God bless you all and thank you.
Why don't you, gentlemen too, we picked up the mic. So let's do the second half of the thing. Let's have our panel start coming up, and be careful that you don't trip over any of these fake plants down here. So I'm going to introduce first our professor, Daniel Kreiss, graduate of Stanford, who specializes in modern political communications. He wrote a well-received book on how President Obama used social media to win in the 2008 election. It came out last summer and was quite a hit in the political discourse. Oxford Press has just given him a contract for a new book. He'll be looking at how the Republicans are trying to match the social media to the political operation. It's called Networked World Politics, Parties, Databases, and Campaigning in the Networked Age. Averi Harper, our student right to my left, a senior, is both a reporter and anchor for our award-winning Carolina Week. I'm pleased to say she just won the Hearst First Place Award for the best hard news story in the nation. I'm bragging about all our people, as you can see, Dr. Brooks. She is vice president of the Carolina Association of Black Journalists, and she was just accepted at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and will be attending in the fall. Emily Bowe, okay, we can do it for, we lost her, but you know, Columbia is a Carnegie Knight school, so it's part of the sisterhood. Emily Bowe is a junior who is both a journalism student and major in environmental science. She is also a key player in our experimental news laboratory, Reese News, where you can find her morning, noon, and night. She is currently content manager for STEMwire.org, a project of Reese focused on science and math teachers. And Dr. Brooks, she was in my class last semester that was on the political election. So I've read all her blogs, and I would say she agrees with a lot of your analysis of the election.
Glad to hear it.
Dan Weiser, a senior here in J School who is concentrating on reporting, but also a major in political science and minoring in history. He spends most of his life at the Daily Tar Heel and is the current state and national editor there. Last summer, Dan interned in Washington at the Washington Times. So the four are going to have a conversation. I'll try to leave a little time to get some questions from you. And as we say, Dr. Kreiss, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. So everyone can hear me. So I have sort of, I guess, moderator privilege in asking the first question, but I want to make sure that our students have opportunities for follow-ups and the like. I wanted to start by talking about something that you did not talk about today, and you don't really mention a lot in your book, but given that we're sitting here at a public university, I think it's important that we talk about it. I'm just wondering where you see the future of public education with respect to the free enterprise system that you write extensively about. And given your arguments in your book quite forcibly about lowering taxes and high taxes are forced income redistribution and the moral value of people earning their success, where does public education fit into that? Where do our graduates fit into that, our current students, given that this is an institution funded by North Carolina taxpayers?
It's a good question, and one that I think about an awful lot. I've taught at public universities before, and I'm really committed to the notion of course, public education at the K through 12 level, but at higher education as well. One of the things that we have to distinguish between is taxation for the purposes of redistribution to get equal outcomes, and taxation to pay for equality of opportunity. These are fundamentally different concepts. It's very hard to find Americans who are against the idea of equality of opportunity. Now, how much is too much to spend, and what's the least wasteful way to spend money in education? That's something that we all have to ask ourselves, because there's a real day of reckoning coming for all kinds of education systems. Whether we like it or not, higher education is sitting on a massive financial bubble, and the bubble's going to break. And when the bubble breaks, we're going to see a lot of insolvency in the higher ed sector. I don't want it to come. You don't want it to come, but it doesn't matter what we want. This is something that we're going to see, and we need to deal with it before the fact with really good leadership to find a way that we can be a flight to value for people who need opportunity. In the K through 12 level, this is a tougher problem. You know, one of the things that we see is that if we care about education reform, it should be because we want kids-centric, parent-centric, and choice-centric education systems that exploit innovation. And that's one of the problems that we've had. Very encouraging me to see left and right coming together around the concept of education reform. And I would urge all of you to be thinking in creative ways about how education systems can be better for serving underserved and vulnerable kids going forward. I dare say that spending money is not the problem on these systems. The problem is not serving kids.
And I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
I was watching one of your past speeches, and you spoke about earned success in relation to learned helplessness. And again, we're at a public university where many students are dependent on financial aid and federal financial aid in terms of Pell Grants and things like that. Where's your stance on federal financial aid and grant aid, need-based aid?
I have written a lot about what's called earned success. Earned success is the belief that you're creating value with your life and value in the lives of other people. It has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with the idea of being able to serve others and create value with our own lives. I've worked a lot with social entrepreneurs. My main area of research was social entrepreneurship when I was in academia. And I've worked a lot with nonprofit leaders who are trying to help people build their own lives as an entrepreneurial endeavor. It's a wonderful thing to see. Nothing about accumulating wealth.
that requires that people have opportunity. It just absolutely does require that we have opportunity, and we all need, particularly in an environment of austerity, to think about how we can serve more people, get more people more equally to the starting line. I'm extremely comfortable with the idea of using public and charitable dollars to give people more opportunities. The problem is that we're spending money differently than that. We're spending money that we're going to see austerity in grants and loans and all types of programs that help people get a great education. We're going to siphon money off that because we're wasting it on other things that are that are not going toward the opportunity society. So I think that all of us who agree with these ideals, we need to be more careful about that. Now that said, one thing that we have to be very careful of, most economists who do work in the higher education sphere know that the federal loan programs are driving up the price of tuitions. They're driving up the market for tuitions, and this is feeding a bubble in that particular market. We know how bubbles work. We saw it when the government decided that people should own more houses and had a government housing policy that was driving more mortgages to people who were could really pretty ill afford the mortgages that they were getting. We know what happens when we have public policies that drive us into bubbles. And so we have to be very clear-eyed about this. This really goes beyond politics. So loans are creating problems beside that go well beyond the notion of an opportunity society.
I was hoping you might actually be able to follow up on that as well. This idea of earned success, earned seems like it's something that's judged by sort of an outside observer, and it seems like it would be something that would be hard to implement in any kind of practical policy setting. So can you speak a little bit more about how that kind of plays into the whole idea?
Sure. Earned success requires that people see rewards, not in monetary terms necessarily, but they see some sort of measurable rewards for their activities, and they feel that they've sacrificed for these things. There are a lot of wonderful social science studies, some of them that you've heard of, fabulous social science, interesting social science studies. There's my favorite one is the one from Stanford in 1972. There's the famous marshmallow study. Walter Mischel is a social psychologist in 1972. He was going to show how he's going to see over several years how sacrifice is correlated with personal success. And the way he did it is he took 4 to 8-year-old kids into the laboratory in a bag of marshmallows. I mean, you can get tenure for anything, really. It's just great. So, and he's in the laboratory and he's filming these kids. You can see it on the internet if you Google this thing. And he says, he puts a marshmallow in front of each kid. And he says, "You want it?" And they say, "Yeah." And he says, "I tell you what, I'm going to leave the room, and if I come back in 15 minutes and the marshmallow is still there, I'll give you another one, and you're going to get 2, right?" Okay. Then he leaves the room. 2/3 of the kids failed within the first 30 seconds, right? I mean, it's like, and some of them are just restraining themselves. And you know, at one point there's a kid banging his head on the table, trying to, you know, okay, it got interesting 10 to 15 years later when they followed up. What did they find? The 1/3 of kids who didn't eat the marshmallow had an average SAT score 210 points higher than the kids who gave in. They had a lot of other social outcomes that were good. Now, this doesn't say that if you don't eat a marshmallow, you get higher SATs. That's not what this is saying. But there is a correlation between the ability of people to sacrifice, the importance of people to defer gratification. And we're in the policy business right now in America of forcing marshmallows into people's mouths. We're basically, in the society that we're going to, we're telling people, you don't have to give up anything. You don't have to have any deferred gratification. And it's becoming a real problem because we actually see the correlation between learning these disciplinary skills personally and success later. That's why earned success really matters, but it's a complicated phenomenon that requires all of us to be thinking about policy incentives and policy prescriptions that can help people in these behaviors.
Dr. Brooks, I actually wanted to get back to, you were talking a little bit before about disruptive innovation in higher education. I know, like you said, there's been a lot talked about rising costs and rising tuition costs. I actually thought you have an interesting story. I saw you had an op-ed in the New York Times about how you'd actually sort of gotten a $10,000 degree at Thomas Edison State College, and you gotten all your credits from elsewhere, other universities, and had mailed in, done the exams kind of off-site. And there's been a lot of talk recently. I think Florida, Texas, different states have started implementing these 10,000 degree programs. But there's been some criticism too, people saying that they're low quality, that they don't really help students, and that they're only for specialized programs. So I wanted to ask you more about kind of your experience, and also, is this something that can help everybody? Because is this something that could work at a big research university like UNC where there's maybe not those specialized programs?
Yeah, so to refer, he's referring to an op-ed I put in the New York Times a month or so ago that got a lot more attention than I expected. And it basically said that I didn't go to college, which is kind of unusual in my line of work. I did go to college. I dropped out of college when I was 19. Dropped out, kicked out. Anyway,
you know, let's not go into details. I mean, it's splitting hairs here, right? So, and I went on the road playing music for 10 years. It was, my parents called it the gap decade, right? And in my late 20s, I decided I was gonna go back to college, okay? And it turns out that's hard to do, right? And I was playing in the Barcelona Symphony at the time, and I called my dad, and I said, Dad, I've decided to go back to college because I want to get a degree, maybe in economics or math, and then maybe you'll get a PhD, and all these grandiose ideas. My dad said, what are you talking about? You can't do that. You started a family. It's irresponsible. Why? And I said, it was all ready. I said, because I'm not happy. Right? There's a silence on the phone, and he says, what makes you so special? But I had to figure out a way to do it. I had to figure out a way to go back to college. And it turns out that there was the beginning of a wave. This was in the mid-90s, early 90s. And there was a new wave of new alternatives for people who wanted to go to college who were non-traditional adult learners. And I did. I went to this place called Thomas Edison State College. Later I got a real master's and PhD, or a more traditional master's and PhD. But I got through, you know, correspondence courses taken at different universities around the country. And I got the whole thing soup to nuts for $10,000 in today's dollars. I got my bachelor's degree for $10,000. Amazing, right? And that's why I wrote it up in the New York Times. And you know, somebody sent me an email saying, well, that's your academic suicide note. I don't know what that meant. But anyway, it was, what it suggested is that we need more opportunities for people. Am I typical? Of course not. But that's the beauty of this country. We're a nation of outliers. We need more opportunities for more people to earn their success in more ways. If we're thinking about people going to college all in the same way, we're doing a disservice. We're doing an un-American thing. We're not looking for ways to succeed. We're pounding them into particular boxes. I could have gone to college when I was the age of the students in here. I would have done okay, I guess, if my heart had really been in it. But when I needed to go to school, I needed an alternative. And for a lot of people, that alternative still isn't there, and that's not right. What does it mean for public universities? Public universities can lead the way. How? By having 3 or 4 or 5 different ways for different people in different parts of their lives and in different careers to get the kind of education and training they need, to be more innovative. Leading the way that way is one of the best ways that we can help vulnerable people.
Right. I want to pick up off that, but also bring this back to the core of your argument, which to me is compelling, which is the question of morality. So first I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by free enterprise, because it seems hard for me to sort of pin down. In part because here you are sort of saying that there is a value to public education. And one of the things public education can do is sort of create more qualities of opportunity. I guess one of the challenges when I think about free enterprise is that I think about free market efficiency, and that the free enterprise is very good at efficiently allocating economic goods, but it often doesn't say much about distribution. Distribution is the moral part of that argument. So you can work full-time in a society like this, but still live in poverty. Free enterprise would say that perhaps that society is far more efficient than a society that everyone shared in those gains. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about sort of the morality here, that paradox that you've talked about between fairness and making sure that everyone has a leg up, and what is ultimately the role of the state in that, if what I'm hearing from you is that education is certainly one of the roles for the state that is legitimate?
That's a great question. Free enterprise is a series of institutions based on the idea that free markets are best when they're viable, that celebrates hard work and merit, that rewards people and lets them keep the fruits of their labors, and it says that basically entrepreneurship is a fundamentally good and moral thing. Free enterprise is not the same thing as free markets per se. Why not? Because under the system of free enterprise, you need a government, you need regulation, you need the rectification of public goods. So under free enterprise, you recognize that government basically needs to do 2 things, in my view. Free enterprise recognizes that we need a safety net to help the most indigent people in the country. Okay? We need private charity, but we also need government to help truly indigent people. We don't need government to help middle-class people and rich people. That's actually a big problem under free enterprise, and not just because it's inefficient, but because it makes it impossible to help poor people who are squeezed out of the system. So number 1 is helping the indigent with a strong, reliable safety net. Number 2 is fixing market failures. Markets fail. When do they fail? Monopolies are market failure. Something that economists call externalities, things like pollution, crime.
Things like public goods, the Army, the Navy, the police, the firefighters. And last but not least, when we have information problems, corruption, cronyism, these are cases when markets actually fail. Indeed, great universities in the public sphere, public schools, these are public goods. These are market failures. They'll be underprovided by private markets, and free enterprise suggests we need to be taking care of these things, not just for the case of equitable distribution, but for the case of efficiency itself, to have the kind of society that we want that distributes and allocates and uses resources in a way that we can do the things that we want, which ultimately are a reflection of our values, our deepest and most closely held morals.
Okay, and I wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction. You were talking about the disarray that is Washington, and you know that Washington's more polarized than it's ever been before. Where do you think think tanks like AEI fit in? What's their role?
Well, AEI has an unusual role. AEI was started in 1938. It was started by business people who felt that the Great Depression was being exacerbated by terrible public policy in the 30s, and that the administration of Washington was using the Depression as a pretext to turn Americans against the free enterprise system. For a lot of conservatives, that sounds like today. That sounds like the same conditions as today, and that means the fight is still on as far as a lot of folks are concerned. So that's one thing, that we need to stand for our values and give a strong intellectual idea-based case for the deep moral values that underlie that proposition. So that's based on our mission statement. Our mission statement is that we're a community of scholars and supporters dedicated to the idea that increasing individual opportunity, maximizing personal liberty, and fighting for free enterprise give the most people the best life. That's literally word for word AEI's mission statement. What role do we play in the conversation of rectifying disarray? We're a place where people come together to have civil discourse. Civil discourse based on their values where they're not screaming at each other. We have Republicans and Democrats who don't actually say that each other are evil, but they exchange ideas. And there aren't that many places in Washington where you can do that. We facilitate those particular conversations. Better conversations, and everybody who comes in knows. I mean, nobody comes to AEI and says, well, this is a completely neutral playing ground. Everybody knows that we have a certain view of the world, but they also know they're going to be treated with respect, and the best ideas are going to get the best hearing. I think that's the role that we need to play.
So tailing off that a little bit, I think this is the last question, but I'm interested, you said before that this is the most divided time you've ever seen in running a think tank in DC, and I'm intrigued with the idea that 100% of people think that fairness is something that should be part of every argument, but how does that play into legislation when obviously you've got different ideas about fairness and what it is? You mentioned in one of your speeches about different experiments that show a transaction between two people. I think there's a $10 bill and two people are in a room and one person gets to give some portion of the money to the other person, and if the other person rejects it, both of them walk out without any money. So, and the results were intriguing because they differed by location. They seemed to differ, I think they did it in different countries. So what are the challenges there to making that come into play in legislation? Yeah,
that's a great question. Fairness, I said that fairness is 100% moral value. Absolutely true. The trouble is, we can't decide what fairness means. Literally 11% of the population means when somebody has more, they should share with somebody who has less. That's fair. Literally 11% of the population prefers that definition. 89% of the population believes that true fairness means rewarding hard work and merit and rectifying indigence, okay, while creating opportunity. In other words, there's a majority definition, there's a minority definition out there. Okay, so we have to figure out how to square these types of things. But when basically we only have one side of the political debate talking about fairness, it's not going to help. So what we actually need is a big debate in Washington about what fairness means, and both sides contending to be fair. It sounds like we're fighting over something that's really amorphous and ambiguous, like love. No. Fairness, and actually, you know what? Love is a 100% issue too. Fairness is something that everybody cares about, and let's bring on a big fight about what's the right definition of fairness and how we instantiate that in policy. We're not even close to doing that right now. You refer to a bunch of really great social science experiments where people are bargaining with each other, and you find that basically if two people are bargaining over something and neither side earns what they're bargaining over, they'll think that an equal distribution is fair. But if one side earns what they're bargaining over, both sides of the bargaining will agree that the person who earns it should keep the whole thing. That's one of the things we find in our experiments, and that says something about what fairness means in society today. Bottom line, we're going to lose unless all of us are saying overtly, we want a nation that's more fair to more people, and we're going to define it in a way that we think suits our values and our morals.
All right, I always feel that at the journalism school, first of all, we have to watch the time, because I know some of you have other classes, but I want to make sure an audience gets a question in there, although I think this has been a terrific panel, really good questions. I'm going to let, you want to ask a question, Ed? Okay, who would like to ask a question? One of our distinguished professors, Dr. Tom Linden.
I'm not in favor of vote suppression. I mean, I think that it doesn't. I mean, vote suppression is a bad thing to do, and nobody should do it. People on the right say that there's voter fraud on the left, and people on the left say that there's vote repression on the right, and both are bad, and I think we should all agree to denounce those things and try to make sure they don't happen every place we see them. We should be equally vociferous in both cases to stamp it out, because it's not democratic, and it's not moral, and it's not right.
I want to thank you all for being a really good audience. I think that you can agree with me. This has been a provocative conversation, and you are not boring. I think dropouts, go ahead, dropouts, because I believe America is always for a second chance. Now, having said that, 4 years is all you've got, undergraduates, because we've got to make sure this, this university, we promised you a 4-year degree. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to some of you send us your articles about this, because I know you've all got to find a lead, and we'd like to see what you pick out as the lead here. And some of you will be going upstairs to the Freedom Forum, and just a round of applause for a provocative conversation. Thank you.